Have you ever noticed that the reality unfolding before your eyes seems to respond not only to what happens outside, but to the way you perceive it? There is something secret in the act of observing. Each glance carries a silent sound, a vibration that shapes the form of the world. It is as if behind every ordinary scene, there were a voice whispering invisible directions. This is the voice of the observer, and it is the one that determines the landscapes that keep appearing before you. We are not talking only about philosophy, but about an intersection between consciousness and quantum physics, between neuroscience and spirituality. Research shows that the act of observing alters the behavior of particles. In inner life, this translates into something even more radical. Your attention creates patterns, your interpretation repeats scenarios. The world is not only what is seen, it is what is sustained by the gaze that insists on seeing it in a certain way. Today you are going to discover how the voice of the observer shapes not only perceptions, but entire paths, like a secret script that updates itself with every choice of focus, and more. How to transform this voice from a mere repeater of memories into a creator of new realities. Because watching this video until the end means accessing a key, the ability to choose what kind of reality will keep unfolding before you. Stay alert. This is not just about thinking differently, but about speaking differently with the universe itself. Throughout this encounter, we will journey through science, symbols, and practices so that you may recognize where your true authorship lies. In the end, you may realize that it is not the world that repeats, but your own voice that keeps it alive. If the introduction opened the crack into this mystery, now it is time to see its mechanics. The voice of the observer is not just a spiritual metaphor, it is also a phenomenon studied in different fields of knowledge. In quantum physics, the double-slit experiment reveals something disturbing. The particle can behave like a wave or like a material body, and this change depends on the act of being observed. The simple fact that there is a gaze upon the process alters the final result. This means that the universe, at its root, responds to testimony. But what does this actually mean for human life? It means that conscious observation is not passive. It is not a neutral reflection of what is already given. It is a field of influence. Each person carries within themselves a frequency, and this frequency is transmitted through the way they observe. The gaze is never silent. It speaks, vibrates, directs, selects. And it is from this selection that continuous reality rises. Neuroscience reinforces this perspective. Studies on brain plasticity show that neural circuits are strengthened as attention is directed. That which you repeatedly contemplate in thoughts or perceptions creates deeper and deeper pathways in your brain. It is as if attention were constant water shaping the stone. Over time, this stone gains grooves, and life begins to flow only through those already opened paths. The voice of the observer, in this sense, is not only a spiritual presence, but also a neurological process that consolidates patterns. And it is not only about observing the external world. The same happens with internal narratives. The phrases one repeats in silence, the mental images one carries, the memories one revisits, all of this functions as observation. Consciousness makes no distinction between looking outward or inward. What is observed gains strength, grows and materializes into new opportunities or unwanted repetitions. We can then say that the voice of the observer is the secret language expressed through focus, a language that does not need spoken words, but that is written in vibrations and frequencies. And this writing does not remain only in the subjective field. It crosses relationships, situations, and even unexpected encounters. How many times have you noticed that certain patterns repeat in your life, almost like similar chapters of the same story? This is not chance. It is the signature of the observer in action. But there is an essential detail. The voice of the observer is not only personal. There is also a collective layer. Entire groups of people sustain certain perceptions, and these collective perceptions give rise to social structures, cultures, traditions. What is maintained by the continuous observation of thousands of consciousnesses gains density in the field of reality. In this way, both the individual and the collective are co-authors of the same stage. However, it is on the individual level that transformation begins. Recognizing the strength of this voice means accepting that we are not only receivers of experiences, but generators of frequency. It is as if each gaze were a brush painting the canvas of life, repeating certain colors or opening space for new tones. The problem is that much of this painting happens automatically, almost unconsciously. People observe always through the same lenses and, without realizing it, sustain realities they no longer wish for. Here lies the deep invitation of this path, learning to listen to your own voice of the observer, not only noticing that it exists, but feeling how it operates in daily life. Every recurring thought, every quick judgment, every silent expectation, all of this composes the vibration that sustains your experience. Reality does not insist on repeating the past out of whim, but because consciousness insists on speaking the same language to the universe. Science already shows that the brain does not distinguish a real experience from one lived in imagination. The body responds to both stimuli with the same electrical and chemical signals. This means that when retelling a story to yourself, when revisiting a scene in thought, you are activating the same circuits as in a real experience. Inner observation is, in this sense, as powerful as external observation. And here a grand possibility opens. If the voice of the observer sustains repeated realities, it can also create unprecedented realities. From here, we begin to understand that it is not only about controlling thoughts, but about cultivating a new way of observing. A way that not only reacts to the world, but recreates it. The power lies precisely in realizing that each gaze is a seed of the future. The way you observe today defines what will be visible tomorrow. And this is the key that separates living in repetition from living in creation. If science reveals the mechanism of the voice of the observer, symbolic language opens another path. It allows us to feel the depth of this phenomenon beyond logic. The gaze is not just a biological function, but a secret ritual renewed every second. By fixing on something, you raise invisible altars. Every perception is a devotional act, a gesture of offering energy, so that a certain form may continue to exist. Think of the gaze as a river that constantly chooses its bed. If it always runs through the same groove, it creates deep valleys, fertile for certain landscapes to flourish while others disappear. The voice of the observer is this river, ceaseless, nourishing scenarios that later become inevitable. What we call destiny often amounts to nothing more than a repeated watercourse, an unconscious loyalty to the same path of observation. But what if the river were capable of changing direction? This is the power of awakened consciousness, moving attention as one who redraws the inner geography. This is where symbols come in, for they work as portals to reorient the gaze. By contemplating a flame, for example, you are not only seeing fire, you are tuning into the language of transformation, reminding yourself of your own power to transmute old narratives into new energy. In spiritual tradition, the practice of fixing the eyes on natural or archetypal elements is not mere aesthetic exercise. It is training for the voice of the observer. The heart learns to sustain different vibrations and, in sustaining them, begins to call forth new realities. Looking at the night sky may awaken in you the experience of the infinite. Looking at running water may teach you fluidity. Each symbol is a mirror of possibilities that, once observed, become seeds. And there is an essential detail. It is not the object itself that matters, but the quality of attention. The same field of flowers can be seen as banality by a hurried gaze, or as a manifestation of the sacred by an awakened gaze. The world does not change, but the voice of the observer creates distinct worlds from the same scenario. That is why two people can live the same situation and emerge from it with completely opposite stories. To make this practical, think of the following exercise. Upon waking, before getting lost in the stimuli of the day, choose something simple to contemplate. It can be a plant, a crystal, a meaningful photograph. Allow yourself to remain in silence, simply observing, and notice what your inner voice says in front of it. Little by little, you will realize that you are not only seeing, but dialoguing. This silent dialogue reveals which narratives you have been nurturing, and more importantly, it opens the chance to transform them. The metaphor of the river shows that it is possible to choose new courses, but the body needs to be trained to sustain this shift. It is not enough to wish to change reality. It is necessary to educate observation. That is why contemplative practices become so powerful. They teach the observer to speak differently. Meditating is not only resting the mind, but teaching attention to leave habitual grooves and create unprecedented paths. The voice of the observer is ultimately an invitation to authorship. If each perception feeds a reality, then each perception can also be the birthplace of a different reality. The difference between living in repetition and living in creation lies in the quality of the gaze. Looking in haste reinforces the already known. Looking with presence opens space for the new. It is here that symbols, archetypes, and rituals take on the role of guides. They remind us that reality is moldable, malleable, permeable to conscious observation. And more, they remind us that it is not about manipulating the external world, but about refining the inner language that converses with the universe. With every gesture of contemplation, you choose the tone of your voice, and that tone echoes beyond the visible, drawing encounters, outcomes, and possibilities that align with what has been sustained in silence. If in the previous part we understood the scientific logic of observation, now we perceive the poetry contained in this act. To observe is not only to see, it is to create. It is a constant rite of passage in which the world ceases to be a stage and reveals itself as a response. The voice of the observer does not describe, it summons. And the more awakened this consciousness is, the more the universe reveals itself as a field of living resonances, responding to the tone you choose to maintain. In the previous stage, we saw how symbols and practices can educate the voice of the observer. But there is something even more challenging. Realizing that before creating new realities, it is necessary to dismantle those that have been sustained unconsciously. The gaze, by repeating the same internal gestures, fabricates invisible prisons. They are retold stories, revisited emotions, nurtured memories that become bars around perception. The great shock happens here. It is not the world that insists on repeating itself. It is your own voice that insists on always saying the same phrases to the universe. This repetition makes you walk through labyrinths where the walls seem immutable, but which in reality are only maintained because they keep being observed in the same way. Imprisonment is not outside, but in the way of seeing. Neuroscience describes this as attentional bias. The brain, trained to look for certain patterns, begins to ignore everything that does not fit into that frame. It is like wearing glasses with colored lenses without knowing they are there. You see the entire scene tinted in one tone and believe the world is that color. This is the strength and also the danger of the voice of the observer. It not only shows reality, but filters it, cuts it, and returns a fragment that confirms its own beliefs. But there is a way out. And the way out is not to fight against the external world, but to alter the silent gesture of observing. The turning point happens when you understand that you can look again, without the weight of memories. This new gaze is not naive, but creative. It does not deny the past. It simply refuses to be loyal to it. It is at this point that reality begins to respond differently. The challenge is that the brain clings to the familiar. It prefers the safety of repetition to the boldness of the new. That is why change is not only mental, but vibrational. It is like changing the background music of a scene. Even if the images remain the same, the meaning changes radically. Altering the voice of the observer is altering the invisible soundtrack that gives meaning to life. And here arises the most liberating understanding. Reality does not need to be conquered, it needs to be allowed. As long as the voice of the observer remains fixed on old plots, creation has no space to manifest. But when that voice opens itself to new frequencies, the unexpected approaches. The impossible ceases to be an enemy and reveals itself as potential. This shift is like waking up inside a dream and realizing that you can decide where the story will go. The scene may be the same, but the way you look at it opens unprecedented possibilities. Pain can be transformed into learning, loss into openness, limit into portal. Everything depends on the vibrations sustained by the gaze. What was once prison turns into passage. It is at this point that practice takes on a revolutionary aspect. Observing differently is not just a technique, it is an act of courage. It demands detachment from the old contours of reality. It requires bearing the emptiness before the new reveals itself. And above all, it requires trust, the faith that life responds to the gaze that dares to be different. Now, I want to propose something concrete. If the voice of the observer creates and maintains what keeps repeating, the first step is to recognize which stories you have been feeding. To strengthen this perception, I want to invite you to write in the comments a short sentence. I am choosing a new gaze. By leaving this sentence recorded, you not only participate in the collective movement of this space, but also send a signal to yourself that you are willing to change the vibration of your gaze. And of course, if this content made sense to you, like this video. This gesture is not just support for the channel, it is also a way of telling your consciousness, I choose to give energy to this new vision. Because every action is a seed, and by planting these seeds together, the reality that unfolds before us begins to take on different contours. In the previous shift, we realized that the repetition of reality is born from the insistence of observation itself. To give substance to this understanding, nothing better than bringing a symbolic story, capable of touching not only the mind, but also the heart. It is said that in an ancient city lived a sculptor who every day passed by a huge stone forgotten in the central square. For years, people saw only an obstacle in the way, a useless weight occupying space. The voice of the collective observer of the city had decreed, "It is just a stone, nothing more." And so the stone remained invisible in its potential, sustained only by the indifferent gaze. But the sculptor was not resigned. For him, that stone carried a promise. While everyone saw only a limit, his observation told him something else. There was a hidden form waiting to be revealed. So day after day he would come closer, study the contours, feel the surface, until one day he began to sculpt. The first hammer strikes provoked laughter from the neighbors. After all, who would waste effort on something so banal? But the sculptor remained firm, guided by the inner voice that showed him something not yet visible to others' eyes. Months passed, and what had once been only weight began to transform into a figure. Little by little, a statue emerged, beautiful and majestic, awakening in the city a new gaze. What changed was not the stone. What changed was the voice of the observer who dared to sustain it differently. The stone already contained the statue, but it required someone capable of seeing it before it became visible. The sculptor did not create only a work of art. He taught the entire city to change its observation, to see beyond the obvious. This narrative echoes directly in what we discussed. How many stones remain in the path of your life simply because your voice names them as obstacles? How many possibilities lie dormant because the gaze insists on repeating them as limits? The sculptor shows us that transformation begins the moment someone refuses to sustain the collective vision and starts nurturing a personal, creative, insistent gaze. Neuroscience confirms that perception is creative. Areas of the brain are activated not only to register the world, but also to anticipate it. The brain fills gaps, completes scenarios, projects futures. This means that in each perception, there is always a dose of creation. The voice of the observer not only describes, it predicts, and in predicting, it shapes. In the same way the sculptor saw a form where everyone else saw weight, you also carry the ability to anticipate a different version of your own life. But what the story also reveals is that this choice is not easy. Sustaining a creative gaze requires constancy. The sculptor was ridiculed, discredited, put to the test, and still he remained faithful to the vision he nurtured. Likewise, anyone who decides to change the voice of the observer in their own life must face the resistance of old beliefs, external voices, circumstances that insist on confirming the past. Courage lies not only in seeing differently, but in continuing to see differently even when nothing has yet changed. This is the symbolic lesson that echoes. Reality bends slowly, like stone being carved. Each strike is an act of fidelity to a new gaze. And each strike, no matter how small it seems, gradually reveals the form that was once hidden. It is not about creating something out of nothing, but about releasing what has always been there, concealed by repetitive observation. The voice of the observer is therefore the hammer and chisel of consciousness. It is what decides whether the stone remains weight or becomes a work. It is what chooses whether life will be repetition or revelation. And in this process, patience becomes a virtue, for each change of perception is also an act of inner sculpture. Perhaps this is why so many spiritual traditions speak of vision as a sacred power. To see is to create. To see is to release. To see is to sustain realities that have not yet manifested. The sculptor reminds us of this. What you see insistently eventually becomes inevitable. Life bends before sustained attention. If in the previous part we recognize the imprisonment of repeated observation, now we also recognize its creative power. The stone already contains the work, but it needs the gaze that frees it. Reality already contains possible futures, but it needs your voice for them to become visible. In the story of the sculptor, the stone was revealed because someone sustained a different gaze until the hidden form showed itself. But how to translate this into daily practice? How to teach yourself that the voice of the observer does not need to cling to what it already knows, but can learn to sustain new frequencies? The first key is to recognize that the body is the antenna of observation. It is not only a mental act, but a felt vibration. The gaze may begin with the eyes, but the sustaining comes from the whole body. When observing something, your heartbeat changes, your breathing adjusts, your electrical field reorganizes. Neuroscience shows that conscious attention alters the activity of the autonomic nervous system, influencing internal rhythms immediately. In other words, training observation is also training physiology. A simple yet profound practice consists of creating a daily space for contemplation. Choose an object or a scene that awakens some sense of presence in you. It can be a flame, a tree, even a fixed point in the environment. The proposal is not just to look, but to feel what your inner voice says as you keep your focus on it. At first, you will notice distractions, repeated thoughts, automatic narratives. Little by little, however, a silent space begins to emerge in which the observed object ceases to be just an external form and becomes a mirror of your internal state. This exercise is not limited to the moment of practice. It re-educates attention for daily life. Throughout the day, you begin to notice that reality is not fixed, but responds to the way you observe it. An encounter, a conversation, a work situation, all of this can be crossed with the repetitive gaze of the past or with the creative gaze of the present. The daily practice is like sharpening the chisel. It prepares you so that in challenging moments, your voice does not automatically repeat what it has always said. Another powerful technique is what we call the breath of the observer. It consists of uniting the attention of the gaze with conscious breathing. Choose a point in front of you, and while observing it, inhale counting to 4, hold briefly, and exhale counting to 6. During this process, allow each breath to be a way of sustaining the vision. The air coming in and going out works as a reminder that your voice creates the field where the gaze rests. This rhythm calms the nervous system and at the same time trains the mind to remain present. With practice, something subtle happens. Reality begins to respond differently. You notice nuances that were not visible before, as if a new layer were being revealed. This change does not come from outside, but from the alteration in the quality of observation. The gaze ceases to be an automatic recorder and becomes an active participant in the scene. And more, this training opens space for a state of conscious choice. You begin to feel that you can at any moment change the invisible soundtrack that accompanies your experiences. The voice of the observer ceases to be an echo of the past and becomes a summons for unprecedented futures. This is true freedom, not depending on the world to change in order to then change your perception, but changing your perception and from it allowing the world to reorganize. There is also a vibrational practice that can enhance this process, quietly speaking phrases that reinforce the new gaze. It is not about mechanical repetition, but about felt affirmation. During contemplation, while sustaining the object with your eyes, allow simple phrases to arise such as, "I choose to see differently," or "My attention creates my path." The sound of your own voice, even subtle, sends signals to the brain and the heart, reinforcing the connection between the act of observing and the creation of reality. The most important thing, however, is not the technique itself, but constancy. Just like the sculptor before the stone, it is intentional repetition that carves the contours of the new reality. One day of practice may bring momentary clarity, but weeks of practice begin to alter the entire field of perception. The world around you seems to align because, in truth, it was your voice that aligned first. Everything we have gone through until now points to a recognition that is simple and at the same time immense. Reality is not only a stage, it is a response. The world does not appear the same to everyone because each gaze carries a voice, and that voice of the observer shapes the contours of experience. It is not magic in the superficial sense, but it is alchemy in the deepest sense. What you sustain in attention transforms into matter, into encounter, into path. If in the practices you felt that the body responds to the way of observing, understand that this is not an exception. It is the very rule of existence. The gaze is a frequency, and this frequency organizes life around it. At the core, every breath, every choice of focus, every internal word is a summons to the universe. The sculptor who carves the stone, the scientist who observes the particle, the meditator who contemplates a flame, all are performing the same gesture, telling reality how it should present itself. But perhaps the most revealing point is to understand that this voice does not need to be rigid nor repetitive. It can be renewed at every instant. You are not condemned to always look the same way. You can choose to sustain a gaze that liberates instead of imprisoning. The universe does not demand certainties, but presence. And presence means speaking to the world with an awakened voice, capable of creating new landscapes. If you made it this far, write in the comments, "I am the voice of my gaze." I want to know that you walked with me to the end of this video. And if this content resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. That way we continue together, sustaining new ways of seeing and, consequently, new realities to live.